A white racist officer stands near his patrol car, laughing as he points at a young black boy's old bike. "What is that? Did you find it in the trash?" he says with a loud, mocking tone. The boy grips his bike tighter, staying calm, but inside, he feels the sting of the officer's words. "Seriously, kid?" The officer continues, shaking his head. "You should just throw that thing away. It's falling apart." People nearby stop to watch, their faces showing unease as they notice the officer's cruel attitude. The boy doesn't speak. He stands silently, his eyes steady, refusing to show how much the officer's words hurt him. But then, before the officer can say anything else, a strong, clear voice breaks the silence. "Is there a problem here, officer?" A tall man walks toward them with confidence. It's the boy's father. His calm but powerful presence changes everything. The officer looks at him, his smug expression fading. The mood shifts, and what happens next will leave everyone watching completely shocked. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Dante was a bright, kind-hearted young black boy who loved riding his bike through the neighborhood. The bike wasn't anything fancy. It was old, worn, and a little rusty. But to Dante, it was special. His father, Elijah, had given it to him, and they'd spent hours together fixing it up. For Dante, every scratch and dent told a story. One warm afternoon, Dante rode toward the park, his favorite place to think and enjoy the sunshine. As he approached the entrance, he noticed a police car parked nearby. Trying not to draw attention, Dante focused on the path ahead and pedaled quietly. But before he could pass, the officer stepped out of his car. Officer Blake, known for his smug and often dismissive attitude, zeroed in on Dante and his bike. His laughter broke the calm of the park as he approached. "Hey, kid," Blake called out with a smirk. "Is that thing even safe to ride? Looks like it belongs in a junkyard." Dante stopped his bike and looked up, his hands gripping the handlebars tightly. The words stung, but he said nothing. Instead, he took a deep breath and stood still, determined not to let the officer's words get to him. Blake took another step closer, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you even know how to ride that thing? Looks like it's going to fall apart any second." People nearby started to turn their heads, sensing the tension. Dante felt a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. His bike wasn't flashy, but it was his. And more than that, it was a gift from his dad, a man who had taught him to stay calm in the face of disrespect. But what Officer Blake didn't know was that Elijah, Dante's father, was already on his way. Elijah was not an ordinary man. He was a highly respected entrepreneur in the community, known for his intelligence, success, and unwavering commitment to fairness. From a distance, Elijah noticed the scene unfolding and quickened his pace. He could see the discomfort on his son's face and the smug grin on the officer's. As Elijah approached, the energy shifted. People who had been silently watching sensed something big was about to happen. Dante looked up and saw his father, and for the first time since the encounter began, his confidence returned. What happens next will change the dynamic entirely, leaving Officer Blake and everyone watching completely stunned. Officer Blake's sneer deepened as he continued to mock Dante. "Hey, kid, where'd you even find this thing? Did you dig it out of a dumpster? No one in their right mind would be caught dead on that rust bucket." He crossed his arms, clearly enjoying himself as people nearby started to glance over at the interaction. Dante, still holding tightly to his handlebars, stayed quiet. His father had always taught him to think before reacting. He tried to focus on staying calm, but the officer's tone was grating. Blake wasn't just poking fun at the bike. He was targeting Dante's dignity. Blake leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a condescending tone. "You should do yourself a favor and get off that thing before it falls apart and embarrasses you even more. Or maybe," he added with a smirk, "you're just used to stuff like this." The sting of those words was undeniable. Blake's tone carried more than just mockery. It carried a message of superiority. Dante looked up at the officer, his expression steady but his eyes filled with quiet determination. He wasn't going to let the words break him, but he also couldn't ignore how unfair and humiliating the situation felt. Meanwhile, a small crowd began to gather. Parents in the park looked over, their conversations hushed as they watched the officer towering over the boy. A few kids on the playground noticed, too, their games slowing as they pointed toward the commotion. The unease in the air was palpable, just as Blake took a step back and crossed his arms, clearly enjoying the power he thought he had over the situation. Another voice cut through the scene. "What's going on here?" Elijah's voice was steady and commanding, a sharp contrast to Blake's arrogance. He walked briskly toward his son, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Dante immediately felt a wave of relief. His father had arrived. Blake turned to face Elijah, his smug demeanor faltering slightly. "This your kid?" he asked, gesturing toward Dante and his bike. "You should teach him to get a better ride. I mean, come on, look at this thing." Elijah's expression didn't waver. His gaze moved between the officer and his son, his calm exterior masking the fire building inside him. "Is there a problem with my son's bike?" he asked, his voice sharp but controlled. Blake hesitated for a moment, then shrugged, just pointing out the obvious. "That thing's a safety hazard. You should get him something decent. You can't blame me for being concerned." His smirk returned, but it didn't last long. Elijah stepped closer, his presence commanding. "You're concerned because it doesn't look good enough for you? Or because my son happens to be the one riding it?" His words were firm and the crowd seemed to lean in, sensing a shift in power. Blake's smirk disappeared entirely. "Hey, I'm just doing my job," he said, trying to sound casual but failing. Elijah wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. Your job is to serve and protect, not to humiliate a child in public. Do you think that's acceptable?" Dante watched silently, his father's strength giving him a renewed sense of pride. Elijah's words weren't just about the bike or the interaction, they were about standing up to the disrespect and prejudice that had become all too common. The crowd grew larger as people stopped to watch the unfolding scene. Some pulled out their phones, quietly recording. Others whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of shock and support. Blake's confidence was visibly shaken. He hadn't expected someone like Elijah to confront him so directly. He took a small step back, glancing at the growing crowd as the weight of the situation began to sink in. Elijah's voice rose slightly, not in anger but in unwavering conviction. "You don't get to decide someone's worth based on what they have or how they look. My son's bike isn't the problem here. You are." The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement. Blake's arrogance was quickly being replaced by discomfort, as Elijah's words resonated with everyone watching. The tables had turned, and the officer found himself at the center of a confrontation he hadn't anticipated. What happens next will not only leave Blake speechless, but will also remind everyone present about the true meaning of respect and dignity. Elijah stepped closer to Blake, his calm yet commanding presence catching the attention of everyone nearby. The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting someone to challenge him so directly. "Officer," Elijah began, his voice steady, "you've made it clear you don't respect my son or his bike. But I want to know, what exactly are you trying to prove by humiliating a child in public?" Blake straightened his posture, trying to reclaim some authority. "Look, I'm just doing my duty. This bike is falling apart. It's dangerous for the kid. Maybe it's time you got him something better." Elijah's lips tightened into a thin line. "So your idea of doing your duty involves mocking and belittling a young boy? You didn't approach him with concern. You approached him with judgment and disrespect. That's not duty. That's arrogance." The crowd surrounding them grew larger, their eyes darting between Elijah and Blake. Some parents pulled their children closer, while others whispered amongst themselves, clearly siding with Elijah. A few had already started recording the confrontation, their phones raised as they captured every word. Blake's face flushed slightly as he glanced at the phones. "Listen," he said, his tone defensive. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just making a point. No need to blow this out of proportion." Elijah took a step closer, his voice unwavering. "This isn't about a bike. This is about you thinking it's acceptable to demean my son just because you wear a badge. You've underestimated him and me, but you're about to find out exactly who you're dealing with." Dante stood silently behind his father, watching the interaction with wide eyes. His grip on his bike tightened, but his heart swelled with pride. He had always admired his father's strength and composure, but seeing it in action now was something else entirely. Blake crossed his arms, trying to look unaffected, but the growing crowd and Elijah's pointed words were clearly rattling him. "All right," Blake said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Maybe I went too far, but let's not make this into some big drama." Elijah's sharp gaze didn't waver. "You don't get to decide when this ends or how it's handled. You think you're untouchable because of your uniform, but that uniform doesn't give you the right to treat people like they're beneath you." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A young woman near the front spoke up, her voice steady but tinged with anger. "He's right. I've seen this officer harass people before. This isn't the first time." Another man chimed in. "Yeah, he's always targeting people who can't fight back." It's about time someone stood up to him. Blake's face turned red as the crowd's support for Elijah became evident. He opened his mouth to speak but was interrupted by a deep voice from behind the group. "Is there a problem here?" All heads turned as a man in a tailored suit approached, his confident stride cutting through the tension. It was Elijah's colleague, Charles, who had been passing by and noticed the commotion. Charles was not just a friend. He was also a prominent community leader known for his work in advocating for justice and equality. Blake's eyes widened slightly as he recognized Charles. His confident facade began to crack. "No problem, sir," Blake stammered, attempting to downplay the situation. "Just a misunderstanding." Charles raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding? From what I'm hearing, it sounds like you've been disrespecting this young man and his father. Is that true?" Blake opened his mouth to respond, but the crowd didn't give him a chance. "He was mocking the boy," someone shouted. "He's been doing this for years," another added. Elijah turned to Charles, his expression calm but firm. "This officer thought it was appropriate to humiliate my son because he didn't like the look of his bike. I'm making sure he knows that's not how we treat people in this community." Charles nodded, his gaze settling on Blake. "Officer, I suggest you take a moment to reflect on your actions. You're here to serve and protect, not to demean and divide. This kind of behavior is unacceptable, and you will be held accountable." Blake looked around nervously, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. The crowd's unwavering support for Elijah and Dante left no room for his usual arrogance. He muttered something under his breath and turned to leave, but not before Charles added, "And don't think this ends here. There will be a formal complaint filed against you." The crowd erupted into applause as Blake walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Elijah turned to Dante, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You handled that with strength, son. Never let anyone make you feel less than what you are." Dante smiled, his confidence restored. The crowd began to disperse, but the lesson of the day lingered in the air. Respect and dignity must always triumph over arrogance and prejudice. Blake had barely walked away when Dante noticed the arrival of someone unexpected, his uncle, Joseph, who was also Elijah's brother. Joseph was a skilled attorney who had gained a reputation for taking on cases involving civil rights violations. He had been passing by when he spotted the gathering crowd and decided to investigate. Joseph approached Elijah and Dante with a calm but determined expression. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone gentle yet firm. Elijah quickly explained the situation, describing how Blake had mocked Dante and tried to demean him in front of the crowd. Joseph's eyes narrowed and his jaw tightened as he listened. So, he thought he could humiliate a child just because he felt like it? Joseph asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Before Elijah could respond, the crowd parted as Blake, who had overheard Joseph's arrival, returned to the scene. "And who might you be?" Blake asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Joseph stepped forward, his presence commanding respect. "I'm Joseph Mitchell, an attorney who specializes in cases involving misconduct and discrimination, and you, officer, have just made a serious mistake." Blake scoffed, trying to regain his composure. "Listen, I've already apologized. There's no need to turn this into something bigger than it is." Joseph's gaze didn't waver. "An apology doesn't erase the harm you've caused. You targeted a young boy, mocked him, and thought you could get away with it because of your badge. That kind of behavior has consequences." The crowd began murmuring again, their attention fixed on the interaction between Joseph and Blake. Some took out their phones to record, sensing that the situation was about to take an even more dramatic turn. Elijah placed a reassuring hand on Dante's shoulder, signaling to his son that everything would be okay. Dante looked up at his father and uncle, his admiration for both men growing with each passing moment. Blake crossed his arms defensively, but his confidence was clearly waning. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just trying to point out that the bike isn't safe. It's my job to look out for safety." Joseph's lips curved into a thin smile, though his eyes remained sharp. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to belittle and harass. What you did wasn't about safety. It was about power. You saw an opportunity to exert your authority over someone you thought wouldn't fight back. But you were wrong." Elijah chimed in, his voice calm but resolute. "You thought you could embarrass my son, but you underestimated him. And you underestimated us." The tension in the air was palpable. The crowd had grown larger, and the whispers of support for Elijah, Dante, and Joseph were growing louder. Blake shifted uncomfortably, realizing he was losing control of the situation. Just then, a patrol car pulled up, and another officer stepped out. This was Sergeant Harper, Blake's superior. Harper had been called to the scene by a concerned bystander who had witnessed Blake's behavior. Harper approached the group, his expression serious. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking from Blake to Elijah and then to Joseph. Joseph quickly filled him in, describing Blake's actions in detail and pointing out the crowd of witnesses who could corroborate the story. Harper listened intently, his expression growing graver with each word. "Blake," Harper said, turning to the officer, "is this true? Did you mock this boy and behave unprofessionally?" Blake stammered, trying to defend himself. "It wasn't like that. I was just trying to make a point about the bike being unsafe. Things got blown out of proportion." Harper's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't sound like proper conduct to me. You're supposed to de-escalate situations, not create them." The sergeant turned to Elijah and Joseph. "I want to apologize on behalf of the department for Officer Blake's behavior. This is not how we operate, and I assure you this matter will be addressed." Elijah nodded, his expression calm but firm. "An apology is a start, but this can't be where it ends. Officers need to be held accountable for their actions." Harper met Elijah's gaze. "You're absolutely right. We'll conduct a full investigation, and there will be consequences for any misconduct." The crowd erupted into applause, their faith in justice momentarily restored. Blake, on the other hand, looked defeated. He glanced at Harper, then at the crowd, and finally at Elijah and Joseph. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his arrogance replaced by shame. As the crowd began to disperse, Joseph turned to Dante and knelt to meet his eye level. "You handled yourself with so much strength today," he said. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small. You're worth more than they can ever understand." Dante smiled, his confidence restored. "Thanks, Uncle Joseph, and thank you, Dad." Elijah ruffled his son's hair affectionately. "We've got your back, always." The family walked away from the scene, their heads held high. They had turned a moment of humiliation into a powerful stand for dignity and justice, leaving everyone who witnessed it with a story they would never forget. As Blake walked away, the incident didn't end there. A bystander had recorded the entire interaction between Blake, Dante, and Elijah on their phone. Within hours, the video was uploaded online, sparking a wave of outrage across social media. The clip showed Blake mocking Dante's bike, Elijah's composed yet firm defense of his son, and the eventual arrival of Joseph. The powerful moments resonated with viewers everywhere. Comments flooded the video, with people expressing their anger toward Blake's behavior. Many praised Elijah and Joseph for standing up against such blatant disrespect. "This is the strength we need to see," one user wrote. Another commented, "That officer's actions are unacceptable. This isn't how you treat anyone, especially a child." News outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach. Reports highlighted Blake's unprofessionalism and the courage displayed by the Mitchell family. Several articles delved into broader issues of systemic bias in law enforcement, using this incident as an example of why accountability and reform were necessary. As the story gained momentum, the local police department faced immense pressure to address the situation. People from the community gathered outside the station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Dante," and "Respect starts with accountability." Protesters demanded immediate action, chanting for the removal of officers who abuse their power. Amid the growing public outcry, individuals who had experienced similar encounters with Blake began to come forward. One man shared a story of how Blake had humiliated him during a traffic stop, while a young woman recounted an incident where Blake had dismissed her concerns about safety in her neighborhood. These stories painted a troubling picture of an officer who repeatedly abused his authority. The department announced an internal investigation into Blake's conduct, but the public wasn't satisfied with just promises. They wanted action. Community leaders and activists joined forces, organizing town hall meetings to discuss systemic issues within the police force. At one such meeting, Elijah was invited to speak. Standing before a packed room, Elijah shared the details of what had happened. "This isn't just about my son," he said, his voice steady but passionate. "It's about every person who has ever been disrespected, humiliated, or mistreated because someone thought they had power over them. We need accountability. We need change." Joseph also took the stage, addressing the legal implications of such behavior. "Law enforcement officers are here to serve and protect," he said. "But when that power is misused, it erodes trust in the system. It's time we hold individuals accountable and push for meaningful reform." Their words struck a chord, and the audience erupted into applause. The momentum grew as more people from the community stepped up, sharing their own stories and demanding a better future for everyone. The backlash wasn't limited to the community. Blake's actions caught the attention of national civil rights organizations. One prominent group released a statement condemning his behavior and pledging their support to the Mitchell family and the local community. They called for stronger policies to address misconduct and bias within law enforcement. The pressure on the police department continued to mount. The chief of police, recognizing the gravity of the situation, held a press conference to address the public. "We understand the community's concerns, and we take them seriously," she said. "Officer Blake's actions do not reflect the values of this department. He has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation." While the announcement was a step in the right direction, it wasn't enough to quell the public's demand for justice. People continued to rally, insisting that meaningful consequences and systemic changes were necessary to prevent similar incidents in the future. Meanwhile, Elijah and Dante received an outpouring of support. Letters, emails, and messages poured in from people who were inspired by their resilience. "You've shown us what it means to stand up for what's right," one message read. "Your courage is a reminder that change starts with individuals who refuse to be silenced." Dante, who had initially felt humiliated by the incident, began to see the positive impact of their stand. "Dad," he said one evening, Do you think things will really change? Elijah placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Change isn't easy, Dante, he replied, but it starts with moments like this, when people come together to demand better. And we'll keep fighting until it happens. As the investigation into Blake continued, the department faced increasing calls for transparency. Community leaders worked closely with officials to ensure that the process was thorough and unbiased. Elijah and Joseph remained actively involved, attending meetings and pushing for policies that would promote accountability and fairness. The public backlash against Blake's actions had sparked a larger movement, one that extended beyond their town. The incident became a rallying cry for those advocating for justice, respect, and equal treatment. Elijah and his family had turned a moment of disrespect into a powerful stand for change, inspiring countless others to speak up and demand a better future. As the investigation into Officer Blake's actions unfolded, he was suspended and required to attend racial sensitivity training. Initially defensive, Blake began to reflect on the viral video of his actions and the public outcry that followed. He realized the lasting impact his words had on Dante and the larger community. Through training sessions and workshops, Blake confronted his biases and learned about the harm caused by discriminatory behavior. Hearing personal stories of those affected by prejudice deeply affected him, making him realize the gravity of his actions. Meanwhile, Elijah and Joseph worked to turn the incident into a force for change. Elijah spoke at schools about standing up for justice, while Joseph collaborated with community leaders to push for reforms in the police department. Their efforts inspired unity within the community, bringing people together to demand accountability and respect. Blake, overwhelmed by remorse, approached Joseph to apologize. "I see now how wrong I was," he admitted. "I want to make it right." Joseph acknowledged his regret and encouraged him to commit to meaningful change. Blake began speaking at community events, sharing his journey and pledging to be better. For Dante, this incident became a lesson in courage and resilience. Watching his father and Joseph fight for justice showed him the power of standing up for what's right. The community, galvanized by their efforts, grew stronger, pushing for reforms that made lasting change possible. This moment of injustice transformed into a story of accountability, redemption, and the strength of unity. It reminded everyone that even in dark moments, growth and understanding can lead to a better future. This story, which began with an act of prejudice, ended as a powerful message of hope, change, and unity. Dante, once humiliated by Officer Blake's actions, became a symbol of strength and resilience for his community. His father, Elijah's calm yet determined stand against injustice, demonstrated the power of staying composed in the face of wrongdoing. The public outcry sparked by the incident led to meaningful reforms. New training programs were implemented for officers, ensuring that respect and equality were at the forefront of their responsibilities. Community leaders began hosting open forums, giving residents a platform to voice their concerns and promote understanding. Officer Blake, who once mocked a young boy for his bike, emerged as a man determined to change. His journey from ignorance to accountability inspired others, showing that no one is beyond redemption when they are willing to confront their mistakes. For Dante, this experience was life-changing. He learned the importance of standing up for what is right and the power of forgiveness. His confidence soared, knowing that his voice mattered and that his community stood behind him. This story teaches us all an important lesson. Injustice and discrimination can be challenged with courage, unity, and determination. It reminds us that change is possible when individuals and communities work together to make a difference. What would you do if faced with a similar situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire hope and change.